Okay, let's unpack this. So, picture this. It's 1966.
Right.
Beatlemania is just absolutely peaking. It's this huge cultural wave, and maybe the world wasn't quite ready, you know?
Definitely felt that way. And right in the middle of all that, John Lennon makes this one comment.
Just one comment, but it set off, well, an earthquake, especially over in the United States.
The famous "more popular than Jesus" line. That's the one we're talking about.
Exactly. And the sources we're digging into today, a YouTube transcript, plus a couple of articles by Dr. Jorge Guerra-Pyres, they argued this wasn't just some throwaway line.
No, they frame it as igniting this massive controversy. And interestingly, they connect it to a much bigger pattern. A pattern they argue is still relevant.
Right. So our mission here, sticking strictly to what's in this material, is to look at these sources and understand how they connect that specific moment in 66 to what they describe as a persistent pattern.
A pattern specifically of religious Christian, according to the sources, attempts to control speech, control expression.
And also, what the sources suggest are the dangers, the real risks, when that impulse, that need for control, really takes hold.
Yeah, and the sources draw some, frankly, startling lines from that event all the way to controversies happening today. It's pretty eye-opening stuff.
Okay, so let's start right there with that initial spark, Lennon's comment. What exactly did he say, according to the sources?
Well, the direct quote they pull is, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now."
Wow. And there was more, wasn't there? A later reflection.
Yeah, the sources also mention him saying something like, "Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me."
Okay. Now, how do the sources interpret his intention then? Was he trying to attack Christianity?
According to the sources, no. Their read is that it was more of a maybe clumsy observation about youth culture shifting in the UK at the time.
Like how kids were more focused on the Beatles than the church.
Exactly. Less an attack, more a comment on changing times, as the sources see it.
But boy, it did not land that way everywhere. The sources make it clear the backlash, especially from the American Bible Belt, the U.S. South, it was immediate and intense.
Intense is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
The sources use the phrase mass hysteria campaign to describe what happened.
What did that look like? What actions did people take?
Well, radio stations started banning Beatles songs practically overnight. There were these big public bonfires, people burning records, and memorabilia.
Well, burnings. Wow, and it got worse.
Oh, yeah. The sources detailed death threats pouring in. And they make a specific point of noting that the Ku Klux Klan got involved in the protests.
The KKK.
Yep. Which the sources argue really highlights this link they're drawing between certain kinds of religious fundamentalism and reactionary extremism.
So the pressure must have been immense, which
Yeah.
led to the apology, right?
Exactly. Lennon was basically forced into a public apology. The sources give us some quotes from that.
What did he say?
Things like, "I suppose that I had said television is more popular than Jesus, I would have gotten away with it. And I'm sorry I opened my mouth." He also clarified, "I'm not anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion. I was not saying we are greater or better. I just said what I said and it was wrong, or it was taken wrong."
That distinction is interesting, taken wrong. The sources pick up on that, right? He felt misunderstood, but also maybe just regretted speaking out.
Precisely. And this is where the sources pivot. They argue this whole episode, Lennon's comment, the backlash, the forced apology,
Yeah.
it isn't just some isolated 60s pop culture drama.
They see it as part of something bigger.
A much bigger pattern is how they put it. They make the case that Christian fundamentalist groups have, for decades, kind of manufactured outrage over pop culture.
How so? What do they mean by manufactured?
Well, the sources claim they react with censorship, boycotts, and hysteria whenever popular culture seems to, even slightly, challenge their specific worldview or norms.
Okay, do the sources give examples beyond Lennon? Modern ones.
Oh, plenty.
Yeah.
They list things like, remember the reaction to the Barbie movie?
Vaguely, yeah. What did they say about that?
The sources note it was called woke propaganda, even satanic, apparently just for encouraging themes like self-reflection.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Olympic opening ceremonies apparently get accused of pagan rituals pretty regularly unless they're, explicitly Christian, according to the material.
Never thought about that one.
And then there are the classics. The sources bring up Harry Potter, Dungeons and Dragons, Pokemon, even yoga. all labeled demonic at various points.
Right, the satanic panic stuff, it seems to cycle back.
It does. And the sources also mention ongoing attempts to censor music and film, like trying to ban rock in the 60s or rap and metal in the 90s, basically trying to restrict, quote, anything outside their moral framework.
So the sources are positioning Lenin's experience not as unique, but as an early, very visible example of this ongoing pattern, trying to control cultural expression.
Exactly. Which brings us to another layer the sources explore, this connection between censoring things, controlling language, and ultimately controlling thought.
Okay, how do they explore that?
One source uses a maybe surprising example.
Yeah.
The South Park movie. Bigger, longer, and uncut.
South Park. Seriously, how does that fit in?
Well, think about the plot, right? The U.S. nearly goes to war with Canada because a movie teaches kids swear words, palavrons, as the source puts it.
Okay, yeah.
The source presents this as satire, specifically aimed at what it calls moralismo cristiano evangelical Christian moralism.
Ah, I see. So the movie satirizes how moral outrage, under the guise of protecting values, can lead to extreme reactions like censorship or even policy changes.
Precisely. Imposing control disguised as protecting values. And this source connects that idea back to someone who apparently saw this decades earlier, Madalyn Murray O'Hair.
O'Hair, she was involved in the Supreme Court case about school prayer, right?
That's the one. Murray v. Curlett, 1963. But the sources suggest her insight went deeper. According to this material, O'Hair saw that some Christian groups didn't just want to censor ideas they disagreed with.
What else then?
They wanted to censor specific words, as if, and this is the quote from the source, words are immoral por si so, immoral in and of themselves.
So censoring the word itself, not just the idea behind it.
Right, and O'Hair, according to this source, saw this focus on language, on words, as a kind of disguise.
A disguise for what?
Not really about protecting children's ears, the source claims O'Hair believed, but about dominar a linguagem para controlar o pensamiento, mastering language to control thought.
Wow.
The source calls it a forma de poder simbólico, profundamente autoritaria, a profoundly authoritarian form of symbolic power.
So the sources are outlining a kind of strategy here, a logic to it.
Yes, according to one source, the logic that censura religiosa, the logic of religious censorship, tends to follow steps. First, something symbolic gets declared offensive. Second, religious groups pressure institutions, schools, media, government. Third, the censorship gets presented as being about moral publica, public morality.
And the end result, according to this source?
The source claims the result is always imposing a única visão de mundo, cristã, branca, patriarchal. A single worldview, Christian, white, patriarchal. That's the source's explicit claim.
And this is where it gets, as you said, really interesting. The sources link this historical pattern directly to more recent politics.
They do. One source points to events like figures like Donald Trump getting elected with huge evangelical support and having a vice president described by the source as a Christian nationalist. They see this as a resurgence of that same underlying estructura, structure.
A structure where politics and religion become intertwined?
More than that, according to the source, where political language starts incorporating claims of poder divino, divine power, as if American politics is somehow an brazo da vontade de Deus, an arm of God's will.
So the argument the sources are making is, this isn't just about hurt feelings over a pop song or a movie. It's fundamentally about power.
That's the core argument presented. It's about trying to impose a specific worldview by controlling what can be said, what can be expressed, what can even be thought.
And what do the sources say is the consequence of all this pattern of attempted control?
They argue pretty strongly that this approach, which they associate particularly with fundamentalist Christianity, actually infantilizes discourse.
Infantilizes discourse? What do they mean by that?
Basically, instead of engaging with ideas, debating, discussing rationally, this approach, the sources claim, just demands obedience. It shuts down conversations before they can even happen.
So preventing actual discussion.
Right, and the sources are really blunt here. They state that if we want rational adult discussions, then what they call this childish hysteria needs to go.
That's strong language.
It is. They even say, and again, this is directly from the material, if religion can't handle being in the room without throwing a tantrum, it shouldn't be in the room at all.
Wow. Okay, so a pretty damning assessment from these sources.
Very. And they circle back to Lenin, pointing out the irony. His prediction that Christianity might shrink or decline. In many places, the sources note, that's happened.
Well, the Beatles' music
is arguably more powerful and culturally present than ever. The sources basically say art won,
And the lesson they draw from that.
that creativity outlives control. It's a core theme they pull out.
They also make a pretty stark contrast, don't they, between how the Beatles gain influence and how they claim Christianity has operated.
Extremely stark. They contrasted the Beatles winning people over with music against what they describe as historical and ongoing attempts by Christianity to silence dissent. The sources explicitly claim Christianity did and still do, quote, kill or threaten people to love them.
That's a very direct and provocative claim from the sources. Do they offer other examples of this silencing?
They mention Galileo and Darwin, people that Christianity tried to silence, according to the sources, but whose ideas were eventually vindicated.
And their conclusion from those examples?
Again, incredibly blunt. Quoting the sources here, they are always wrong.
So pulling it all together, what's the big picture the sources are painting for us here?
It seems to be this, starting with Lenin in '66. Tracing through decades of what they see as attempts to censor pop culture and analyzing the impulse to control language itself. The sources frame this whole history as a persistent struggle.
A struggle between what?
Between attempts to impose control, often religious, often targeting speech and ideas, and the power of creativity, critical thinking, and, well, art, which the sources argue ultimately endures and wins out.
Okay, so to quickly recap the thread the sources weave, we started with that big reaction to Lenin's comment in 1966.
Right.
Then explored how the sources view that not as isolated, but part of a decades-long pattern of trying to censor popular culture.
And then we got into their argument that controlling words, controlling language, is really about controlling thought and pushing one specific worldview.
And the sources are pretty clear on their perspective of the impact. They argue this pattern infantilizes discourse. It gets in the way of real, rational discussion.
Yeah, it hinders society's ability to grapple with new ideas, basically.
Which leaves us with a final, quite provocative thought from the source material itself. They literally ask, how much longer will the world keep entertaining their tantrums?
And they follow that by claiming history shows that the people and ideas Christianity has tried to silence usually end up being proven right.
So the question that lingers from all this, based entirely on the sources we've discussed, what are the real long-term costs when these attempts to control speech and expression keep happening? Not just for the artists or thinkers targeted,
but for society as a whole, for our collective ability to actually engage with change, with new ideas, with the diverse and evolving culture all around us. That seems to be the critical question the sources leave you with.